Today we're talking about making your own mythology. This is beneficial for sci-fi, apocalyptic, fantasy, pretty much anything that isn't reality. And even if you want to do reality, in some ways people create their own mythos nowadays. Modern myths are definitely very much a thing. There's all sorts of things where people are like, oh yeah, this and that happened, and you're like, did it though? So, with mythology, it's important to remember these specific definitions. I found these on a fantastic website about writing for like Kindle publishing and stuff like that. I thought it was great. So I'm going to use these definitions because they're really well done. A myth is an ancient story that explains the mysteries of nature, humanity, or the cosmos, often involving gods or heroes with supernatural powers. Myths convey the worldview and the values of the culture. That is going to be different from a legend. It's important that we define these things so that we are not saying, this is my mythology, and it's not a mythology. A legend is a story rooted in past events or heroes, but likely exaggerated and embellished over generations of storytelling. Legends blur fact and fiction to create compelling tales. So a lot of things like this are like Abraham Lincoln, where it's like, he was a real person. There's a lot of him that is very real. But there's also a lot of things where people are like, did you know he did this? And everyone's like, are we sure he did that? Or is that just something people have made up over time because they thought he was so awesome? Which he was, but that being said, it makes it so that it's hard to tell what is real and what isn't real. Now, a folktale, a fictional story originating from common people that spreads through an oral tradition, so it's not typically written down. Folktales use fantasy and archetypes to teach lessons and transmit the culture. So a lot of these are ones like, mythology can have a lot of folktales in it. For example, a lot of the stories of Loki were folktales that then got written down and became a part of mythology later, because Loki was a problem. And so they blamed all their problems on him. Next is fairy tales. Fairy tales are a folklore story that has been written down and published by a specific author. Fairy tales adapt oral stories into literary form. So, folktale is pretty much entirely like, I once saw this cool thing, and like just telling you it. Sorry, for some reason I decided to go southern. But fairy tales are like Cinderella, Sleeping Beauty, ones that have and were folk tales that someone eventually said, I just want to write my own version, and now it is considered that version. So like, for example, Grimm's fairy tales, we don't actually know if they were the first ones to write those down. As far as we're aware they are, but perhaps someone wrote them down and then tossed it in the fire because they were like, man, nobody cares. Like, we don't actually know. They're just the first ones who published written down versions. Yes, question?
There was something messed up the book room.
That's fair. They're pretty intense.
Like,
But that also shows a lot of their culture, because back then it was a really dark time and a really dark place, and so they were trying to honestly be true to reality. Unfortunately, is the fact that they lived in a dark time, and so they were like, these fairy tales aren't going to be pretty either. They're going to be dark and messed up as our lives are. Because it wasn't a great time, honestly. Everyone thinks like, oh, the Renaissance era was so great and all these things, and not necessarily. So as a result, it's important to remember that those can also color our own experience of that culture. There's a reason why there is also too many different versions of those stories. There is a Cinderella myth that is African and distinctly theirs, and there's a Cinderella myth that is Asian and distinctly theirs, and there are all sorts of these kinds of things. We don't know why or how this happened, but it did, and they're all distinctly different and show what the cultures value too, because the way they are told tells us, hey, they valued X, Y, and Z things. And that's going to be important to making your own mythology too. Any fairy tales that you have within your spectrum of your story is going to tell us what your culture values, ultimately. Alright, last thing, what we're actually going to talk about today in more in depth is mythology. This is a collection of all the above, myths, legends, folk tales, fables, etc., of a particular culture. Mythology forms webs of stories that then shape the group's cosmology, culture, and identity. So, moving right along, first thing you want to probably do when doing a mythological creation for your world is you want to research other mythologies and figure out what and why they have various things. Hello. I know you.
I think I left my glasses here.
That's hilarious. You're all good. Good to see you. Bye. That was hilarious. I told him he left his glasses here last week. All right. So, sorry, it was very funny. With this being said, you're going to want to also determine how it's going to be shaped based on the environment. If, for example, if it's a desert community, you're probably not going to be talking about the big giant jungle trees. It's important that you have it be shaped by where they're growing up and where they're living as well. A great example of that is a lot of desert cultures have a lot of mythology around how rain is brought in because it's necessary for life. That water is super important. Whereas people who live in the jungle probably are going to tell more stories about the big beasties that you need to avoid in the jungle before they eat you. So those both go to show different values. One, they have rain all the time. They couldn't care less if rain showed up or didn't because of the fact that it's there all the time. Whereas what they care about is not wandering off into the forest and getting eaten. So it's important to keep in mind what your culture looks like. It's also important to keep in mind how your culture has evolved, because obviously we're talking about more like baseline cultures. But if you're going into like, is it a patriarchy? Is it a matriarchy? Is it neither somehow, even though that's very rare? How does that work? How does that look for you? I know that, like, for example, there were matriarchal cultures in the Iroquois where they would then have the men move in with the woman and adopt their last name. Entirely different from European cultures where it was like the women were basically man's property. Drastically different. And yet that is going to help shape the mythology and what that looks like. A great example of equal footing is the fact of Vikings. A lot of the mythology is not just, and the man saved the day. A lot of it's, and this big freaking woman came out of nowhere and slammed everyone and she won. And so it's like, it's both. It's very much got empowered men and empowered women because they were both considered equals and incredibly important to society. Yes, I agree. I think Viking culture was very cool. All right, next thing I would say is start with, as we were talking about, the main values of the society and what they view as the most powerful. More than likely, what they view as the most powerful is also then going to dictate how they react to things. Can we shut the door just so that way I don't feel like I'm interrupting other people? Thank you. I don't want a random patron coming over and being like, you're being too loud. And I'm like, I'm not trying to be loud. That being said, you can also do creatures that represent those things. A great example of this is the classic indigenous peoples myths of coyotes and things like that being the wild trickster and things like that. Or ravens being a bad omen or things like that. Those are all incredibly important and interesting ways of portraying the exact same stuff. That being said, you want to determine which of those you want to do. The main way to determine this, hello, please remember to close the door behind you, thank you. The main way you're going to determine whether you do creature base or people base, or neither, is what they value. So if you're basing it in creatures, like most of the indigenous people, it is because of the fact that they view creatures and earth as sacred. And so as a result, a lot of their creation myths revolve around earth did this, animals did this. Like, there's no people, really. The land and the animals are sacred, and then the people are the lowest of the low. Whereas you find in a lot of Roman and Greek mythological myths, it's quite the opposite, right? The big, powerful, mighty Zeus. And the animals were there for Zeus's playthings and, things like that. And Zeus created the nature, so ultimately he is the all-powerful, mighty man. And that is the classic kind of definition when it comes to if they value people. because in Greek and Roman mythology, they very clearly valued people more than they did nature and animals. So that's also going to change how your things look with your mythology. Then there's also kind of an equal footing where you have the classic Egyptian half beast, half man, where they did a little bit of both. They were like, we think animals are sacred, but we also think people are sacred. So what if we just together? So you can definitely get creative with it, is my point. Like, there is no such thing as a wrong mythology or a bad mythology. The only thing that's bad about a mythology you're creating is if you basically just make it discount Greek. And even then, that technically could be legitimate if Greek people actually existed in your world, because that's what Roman mythology is. So, that's the funny thing about Roman mythology, is that everyone's like, it's its own original, and I'm like, no, it's just different names, same thing. So that's, even that isn't illegitimate. You just need to make sure that if you are basing it on someone else's mythology, you need to explain why. Was this fantasy world originally populated by the Greeks and then they left? Was this mythological fantasy world originally populated by elves and then those elves left and became Vikings, and that's why it's so similar to Norse? Those things could all make sense. That being said, the next thing that you want to do is, if you create a god or gods or creatures, you want to figure out what creatures and what gods represent what. And if you're doing a singular god-based mythology for your society, and I just do say mythology because I don't care what your beliefs are, believe in what you want to believe in. I'm not saying your religion is a mythology, I'm just saying that there are some mythologies out there with a single god that I personally don't believe in. So, each reach their own. If you want to believe in the big flying spaghetti monster, go ahead. Like, that's up to you. No judgment here, believe in whatever you want to believe in, but this is just how to write these things. If you have a singular god, you've got to make sure that even they still have specific things they are over. Even if they're omniscient and all-powerful, they typically are given certain traits, right? Certain mythologies are like they're merciful, others say they're immerciful, and they're just completely and utterly like, if you're a sinner, die. Like, that's going to change your culture and your mythology there and your religion there. You also got to decide, is it a religion that people actually believe that could be real, or is it a mythology where people are believing this and it isn't real? Not to say that any of these ones I haven't talked about today could be believed by someone. If you want to believe in Greek mythology or Norse mythology or indigenous stories, by all means. Who knows? Maybe that is real. I don't know. I have my own religious beliefs. Just want to clarify that in case. I actually did have a friend who believes very firmly in Nordic stuff.
Really?
Yeah. So as a result, that's why I'm like, no judgment here. If you think that's real and that's what you want to believe in, go ahead. I'm not judging you by saying it's a myth. I'm simply saying that this is typically what people have defined. But yeah. So that being said, also keep in mind that if you do a pantheon of gods or certain creatures being over certain things, they don't have to have just one thing. Typically, they don't have just one thing in most mythologies. For example, Zeus. He was the god of sky, lightning, thunder, but also law, order, destiny, and fate. Most people don't know the rest of those things, though, because of the fact that even though he was worshipped for those things, those weren't his main things. So it's important to remember, when you make your own mythology, you can have main things they are over, but also they have some minor things they're over, too.
Destiny and fate? Is that why almost all hot ones die brutally?
Pretty much. That about sums up mythology. Zeus said, I don't like you. So that could also be a part of your myth, is like, why do all of these demigods die? Well, this particular god said, I don't like you. So that is very much a thing. That is also why a lot of Zeus's kids are the ones that are in mythology, which is the most hilarious thing. I actually did some research today and found out that even though Zeus gets made fun of for like having the most demigod kids, he actually is not the one who has the most demigod kids.
Who is that?
Poseidon.
Really?
But he just gets away with it because of the fact that Zeus didn't hate any of his kids. And Whereas Zeus, he only has 101 kids technically written down, whereas, which is funny because then when you hear Poseidon's is 172, that makes you think again. So, as a result, technically Poseidon beats him out, but most of the time Zeus was like, I love my kids the most, so they're going to become famous, whereas Poseidon was just like, go be happy. So, as a result, we don't really know about most of his kids because they're such minor parts of the mythology that we just don't really care too much.
You know what?
Go live! Exactly, go do your own thing, be happy.
Okay, you're gonna be a warrior.
Exactly.
All these things.
You have to be
So
famous, become a king. Like,
Zeus
Zeus is like those parents with high expectations who are like, you gotta be a doctor when you grow up, and you're like, but what if I don't want to be? And they're like, excuse you, you will be. Whereas Poseidon was just like, bro, if you want to go like sail the sea and disappear, go ahead. Like, just be happy. But anyway, so fun fact of the day. Then you have into account any minor gods or minor omens or signs with the regard of creatures. Minor gods and creatures complement the main values. So, for example, Dionysus. He's the god of wine, pleasure, and festivities. Something that they didn't highly prize as part of their culture, but people definitely enjoyed it and liked it. It's kind of like the patron saint of thieves and things like that, where people definitely believe in those things and definitely think that they are real and definitely follow them, but they are not the main pantheon. They are part of the side pantheon, those that are worshipped by the fewest amount of people. With that being said, how do we incorporate these things into our stories without just info dump? Because that is always hard, right? Avoiding the info dump is one of the trickiest parts of all writing history. So, best way to do it is showing and not telling. However, here's examples of how to show that. I found this on a website called Refiction, and I actually thought it was really cool. I don't know why it's called Refiction, but it was cool. An old legend might hold a clue to the main character's quest, or motivate the hero when they need it. Or maybe there's a prophecy that's super ancient and part of mythology that then involves the character, and they are the new person. You also might find out that a myth is actually true, kind of like in Percy Jackson, where he's like, whoa, this is actually all real, and like, he's my dad, like, that very much is something that then makes it so that when he tells a bunch of mythological stuff, it doesn't feel like info dumping. It feels like Percy being like, I didn't know all this cool stuff, so now I'm going to tell you all the cool stuff. Next thing I would say is solving the mystery of an old story. So if there's an old story and you think X, Y, and Z factors about it, but it turns out X, Y, and Z factors are actually the reality of the legend or the story, then by all means be like, hey, this is an old story, and then when they discover what the reality is, then you can use it to kind of hint and give bits and pieces instead of just bleh, here's the old story. You can also have it be related to the context. If someone goes missing or is kidnapped, and there's this story of this old, really weird, crazy ghost that is just, kidnapping children, that's a good time to introduce that, is right after someone's been kidnapped. Also discovering ancient ruins. Because, don't we talk about ancient Greek mythology and stuff like that when we see ancient ruins in Greece and ancient ruins in, the stones in the British Isles and things like that, where you're like, you see these ruins and you go, oh, cool, this reminds me of this mythology. And so ruins can definitely be a great way to introduce it too, if you're having them like walk through an old ruined city and be like, I remember that as part of their culture. They used to have festivals for days or something like that, and so when you're walking through these ruins, you see all of these like markings of the fact that someone had a festival here or something like that. Hello, feel free to come sit down. We are just in the middle of talking about how to create your own mythology system for a video. If you don't want to be a part of the video, just don't come in front of my computer. Alright. Also, a great way to introduce mythology when you're writing about mythology is having characters tell other people who don't know about it. So, for example, if someone is from if you have two characters and one is from China and the other is from England, they might not know all these fancy Chinese mythologies, right? And so having the British person be like, I don't know what's going on here, and the Chinese person be like, I think it's this particular mythological creature. That's a good way to introduce it because they genuinely don't know. And so you're able to introduce it easily into the story without having it be too intense. All right. Next thing you want to take into account if you're writing a mythology is how was your world created? And again, this relates back to what they value the most. Do they value the sea? And so as a result, your world rose up out of a big body of water. Do they value animals? And so as a result, a bunch of animals helped form the land and form the world. Do they believe that people were the most powerful and it's like Zeus, and Zeus just like, poof, pow, land. And all those kinds of things. That is definitely going to tell us a lot about how your world was created. Is going to tell us a lot about your people. And if you do want to do a creation myth that somehow is involved with your character, I would say just do it in a one paragraph bit. If you're like, and the land rose up out of the sea, and there's this specific magical sea stone at the heart of this specific mountain or whatever, and then they gotta go seek it in the story, that makes sense and it's now relevant. And so as a result, you're like, this is how this is relevant to my story. You just gotta make sure that it does have relevancy, because if you're just info dumping for the sake of info dumping, you're gonna lose your reader. And if you're just like, I'm gonna tell you 27 pages worth of mythology and none of it has to do with the plot, then your reader's gonna be like, I'm intimidated, running away now. You don't want your reader to run away in fear. That's not good. All right, last thing you want to talk about is there magic / do they believe in magic? If they don't believe in magic, why not? If they do believe in magic, what kinds of magic? What makes your magic system work? For example, with Greek mythology, people didn't have magic themselves, but the gods had magic. And so becoming a priest or priestess of a god might give you magical powers, or if you were born of a god, you might have magical powers, but normal mortals generally didn't, with very rare exceptions. Exactly, very rare exceptions. And even then, he, I believe, was gifted that power by someone more powerful. And so as a result, it's like, there's a chain of command within Greek mythology. Is there a chain of command in yours? Or does everyone just have magic? They just don't know how to access it. They need to be properly trained. That was very much closer to Celtic mythology, where in Celtic mythology, anyone theoretically could use magic, but because of the fact that it was all based in a druidic system, you had to become a druid in order to use it. If you didn't want to become a druid, then no magical powers for you. Last thing that I want to talk about is how do they deal with non-believers? Because some mythologies are totally accepting and like, yeah, it's fine if you don't believe in my mythology and you believe in a different mythology. That's fine. But then other people are like, you don't believe in my mythology? Die. And so as a result, make sure that when you're building this world, you do take into account how they deal with non-believers. And you do address it. Because if a fake religion that you have created and made a mythology for is an integral part of your story, so is going to be how they deal with non-believers. Because you're going to run into one. Not everyone on the whole planet believes in one religion. That would be insane. that would be wild, because we're all drastically different people with drastically different cultures. Wow. If you want to try that, by all means do, but just know you're going to get a lot of editors and publishers looking at your story going, okay, but how? How did you get world peace by them all believing in the same religion? Because most of the time people fight even within a religion and then create new religions because they're like, I don't like your part of the religion, so I'm going to go make my own. Speaking of which, you can also have that if you want to have different sects of your religion, where you have this sector believes in this and this sector believes in that, but they're all stemmed from the same godly pantheon. By all means, that works too. It's kind of like with the Roman gods, where they basically took the Greek pantheon and were like, we're going to make it our own because we don't like yours. Yes.
In that scenario, where different,
yes, with different sectors and things, branching.
Branching off
Yeah.
of other things, would it be more or less likely, or does it matter? Like, they would fight about that, or like wars or whatever?
Depends on how intense they are about the religion. Like I said, if they are like non-believers should die, then definitely war, problems, sabotage even.
Okay.
I could totally see that being the case. But if they're like, it's fine if you're a non-believer, I just believe in my own thing, kind of like back in Greek times where they were like, oh, you believe in the Roman pantheon, cool. You believe in witchcraft, that's also cool. Like, then you're not going to have as many problems with that.
Okay.
Some people still might be biased against it because that's just individuals. But in general, you want to see, how does the religion view it? Does the religion say all those who don't believe are sinners, or does the religion you're creating say those who don't believe are simply misguided, and so like be nice to them?
Okay.
That's going to change how your world functions.
What if it's like pretty much everyone in this
No, I'll
world
get you.
believes that it's like fact that at least this happened, but then other people
Right.
are like, and then that happened, or really it was this, and
It's
but they
still
all
gonna-
believe something.
It's still gonna determine based on what their religion ultimately believes about non-believers.
Okay.
Because of the fact that, for instance, even with real modern day religions that people believe are real, and I'm not saying they are or aren't real, I'm simply saying they exist. For example, with Latter-day Saints, there are several branches of Latter-day Saints. And some of the branches are like, hey, it's totally fine, like it's great if you believe something else, whatever. And then there are other branches that believe that, oh my gosh, you even interacted with someone who isn't a believer, like, no. And so as a result, it does depend on, like I said, how the religion views that non-believer system.
Okay.
Yeah. Good question.
Alright.
Yes.
So if I created a completely dystopian, utopian society where we believe that everyone has their own specific lives and anyone who strays off that life deserves to be executed.
That's definitely intense. Continue.
Yeah. Very dystopian. If I were gonna do that,
Mhm.
wait, what was it?
Religion/mythology wise.
Yeah, so I'll get back to you. I forgot what I
Okay,
was gonna
that's
say.
okay. That's okay. Any other people have questions about creating your own mythology/religion for your fantasy/sci-fi world? No? Cool. I will come back to your question then whenever you remember it. And I'm going to turn off the video. If any of you guys have questions, please feel free to ask me. I would also like to say hi to you since I've never seen you before. Please remember that these videos are going to be recorded every week, so if you ever are sick or anything like that, they'll still be here. And as far, and contests. Reminder, the Scary Story contest is not run by me. I will be one of the graders, but it is not run by me. So as a result, that's why the rules look so drastically different, is because it's not my contest, it's my coworker's contest that she had long before I came here. I entered her contest when I was small because it was long before I got here. With the Scary Story contest, the word limit is 1,200 words. It is pretty tight, it's pretty intense. I do have a video for those of you who weren't here talking about how to write really, really, really short stories. So if you go to YouTube and look up American Folk Library, it's within the last couple weeks, so it should just be on that Teen Writers Club list. If you're having any trouble with that, please let me know. I can definitely send you the link directly if you need it. That being said, we also have coming up November is going to be a first chapter contest. Now that is going to be the regular rules that I have set. 1,500 word being the preferred minimum, with 6,000 words being the absolute maximum. And I am setting it as an absolute maximum now. I used to say it was okay if you went a little bit over before, but now due to the fact that I've had several people do intensely more than 6,000 and then say, is this okay? And I've had to say no. I'm setting this as a hard rule. So if you're like 10 words over, that's fine. Any more than 10, and you're gonna have to figure out a way to cut down. 6,000 is the hard limit. So that's the first chapter contest, and then in December we have a cozy mystery contest. It's a cozy mystery set during Christmas time is the premise. So as a result, when I say cozy mystery, you can even have a murder in it. Just make sure you're not describing like all the blood and deaths. That's what cozy means. Is it just means you're very comfortable and you don't go gory and in depth on the murder. You go in depth on them solving the murder. A great example of this is Psych.
Oh, yes.
They're goofy, they're silly, but they're not constantly being like dead body, deep descriptions about dead body. In fact, if anything, Gus is usually running to the bathroom because he's going to be sick. And that's what makes it cozy, is the fact that you're not focusing on the death, you're focusing on them solving the death. Same thing with cozy mystery here. Keep in mind that typically with the minimum word limit that I set, it is a guideline, not a rule. So you will not be rejected if you have less than 1,500 words, but just keep in mind, generally 1,500 words is a good amount to write when you're doing a very complex plot. That's why I was like, with the scary story contest, that was not my choice. Very hard to word limit, but we'll see how it goes. I just hope that people enter and that it goes well. I'm going to turn off the video now. If you have any specific questions, feel free to ask. Let me turn this off.